Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Just Participation Season 2, Voices from the Ground in Vancouver.
We're your hosts, Nadim, Daniella, and Sarah. Today we're joined by Denali YoungWolfe, Lama Mugabo, and Moroti George from Vancouver, British Columbia.
Vancouver is the capital city of British Columbia, a province in Western Canada. Known for its rich natural scenery, you can find the Rocky Mountains here. Vancouver is also home to several First Nation communities and resides in the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Skokomish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations.
Our guests for today will be discussing their experiences in advocating for democracy and community engagement in the Vancouver region, and will highlight issues of Indigenous story mapping, housing injustice, and art-based civic engagement. So, hello, Denali. Thank you for joining us today on Just Participation. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and your journey into story mapping and Indigenous community-based research?
Of course, thank you for asking. My family comes from Muskegon First Nation in Treaty 4 Territory, Saskatchewan. I'm currently finishing a PhD in political theory at the University of British Columbia, and my dissertation is story work. I look at the power of hero stories to express agency, authority, and legitimacy. For me, everything starts with the land. I think that we are the land's stories, woven together with the standing people, the trees, the sitting people, who are the stones, the flyers, the swimmers, the walkers, which is us, and the crawlers. We are just one thread in the earth's vast tapestry. But in our stories, the heroes are almost always those who teach us how to care for the land. Because when the land thrives, so do we. And that's what I call assurgency, growing towards what nurtures us. So my work is all about gathering and amplifying hero stories that nurture us. And my project, the Akamiyitamoan project, Akamiyitamoan means we rise. And I went home and I asked community members a simple question. Who is an Indigenous person that you look up to and why? And what I found was incredible. In 250 stories of Indigenous role models and heroes, I uncovered 500 more stories. And within those, 1,500 story threads. And when you weave all those threads together, patterns emerge. And the strongest pattern, nearly every story is rooted in land-based practices, hunting, harvesting, traveling, ceremony. These are what scholars call kinscapes, living landscapes of kinship that connect people, places, and more than human relatives through shared practices and responsibilities. So why does that matter? Why do I care about this? Most maps that we see about Indigenous people and lands are what you would call counter maps. They're made to resist state infringement, to prove land use to the government. Those maps are important, but they often reduce Indigenous people to artifacts and center the state's perspective. And my work asks a different question. Where are the maps that aren't a response to the state? What if maps of kinscapes and active presence, values, and relationships were the maps that we were making? What do those show? What do those tell? Who are those for? So hero stories, the ones that were shared with me, are stories of kinscapes, of agency, authority, and legitimacy, the elements of nationhood that you rarely see on state-centric maps. These stories show identity, belonging, and care for the land and each other. So in a way, my journey has been about mapping not just territory, but relationships, creating a cartography of what nurtures us and what keeps our communities strong and connected across generations. So basically, if you imagine, this is less about data extraction and more like sitting in your auntie's kitchen, sharing tea, sharing stories. That's the heart of it. Basically, my work, who I am, what I think is important and why I'm doing this, is that I don't want to parachute in with recorders and questionnaires. I want to sit with my family and my relations because that's who I care about. And I want these stories to matter because they matter to me. They matter to us. So this is not questionnaires. I'm weaving kinship. I've spent about 2 years visiting relatives, community members, attending ceremony, listening, not for trauma narratives, which dominate so much Indigenous research, but for stories of heroes. These aren't data points. These are living threads in our kinscapes. And academic research often treats these stories, all stories, like commodities. Like, here's your gift card, hand me over your trauma. My work, I want no part of that. When someone shares a hero story, they're not giving me data points. Each story is embedded with value relationships that map active presence, not just resistance. Every storyteller owns their story. The stories will eventually be returned to my community in the form of a hero book. This is not just a dissertation. It's not for me, even though I benefit, obviously. It's for my community. And a book is a living archive that benefits our community. And that's because that's what they wanted. So in staying grounded in all of this, these maps require that we follow protocols. Some of the stories, they stay with the land, not with the laptop. Some of these stories are not for the book. They're not, you can't ask for hero stories and only get hero stories. What you get is stories. And then it comes to me to carry those stories in a good way and know what belongs in academia, what belongs in the book, and what belongs only in the relationship within which it was shared. So that's a little bit of an introduction to who I am and the work I'm doing.
You're the lead research assistant with the Indigenous Research Cluster at Participedia. I'm just wondering, could you let us know how your work there has helped shape or amplify Indigenous-led approaches to civic engagement and knowledge sharing?
Yes, great question. I'm so excited about my work with Participedia. I think of it like this. Democratic theory has been stuck in an Anglo-centric or Euro-American like echo chamber for decades. The Indigenous Research Cluster that I'm a part of is a new cluster. I don't want to say we're the best, but kind of we are, obviously. And we're smashing those walls. We're not just including Indigenous voices, we're centering them as the blueprint for reimagining Anglo-centric democracy. Take the Semangis community in Taiwan, for example, fighting for territorial rights using ancestral land stewardship principles. Or the Adivasi in India, demanding religious recognition through grassroots assemblies. These aren't just case studies that we're making. These are stories of sovereignty. These are masterclasses in sovereignty. And it extends beyond academia. So last year, I was fortunate enough to join Participedia just before the Cape Town Conference and Methods School. So last year in Cape Town, I sat with everyone from grassroots advocates to UN advisors, all of them engaging in recognizing, celebrating, and building democratic theory, democratic practice. Some of it was innovation. For others, it was just traditional and ancestral. And that bridging of worlds is Participedia's superpower. Now we're taking it to Rio for the next Methods School. And this time we're kind of in sync with COP30, or COP30 is happening in Brazil, just like the Rio Methods School is, within a pretty close amount of time. And so many of our people, they're essentially taking this to COP30. We have negotiators, we have people who are working in the Amazon, we have people working in Indigenous communities all over the world who are coming to this, and their voices, their platforms. This is a way for us to platform Indigenous leaders from the Amazon in specific, but also other places, and teach climate justice and practices like forest citizenship. These are conversations that have been absent from those large international forums for too long. So imagine swapping policy jargon for fire circles, where elders and community leaders and activists who are experts at a level that the global phenomenons can't imagine. We're explaining earth-based governance to a group that is finally listening. And the goal of that, the goal of our method school, of the Indigenous Research Cluster, of the cases we do for Participedia, the goal of all of that is basically to shrink the gap. The colonial system loves to tokenize Indigenous knowledge. And our workshops, territorial defense, free prior informed consent, like all of these workshops that we do, they're not academic exercises. They're a training ground for dismantling extraction logic. We're building a global network where strategies cross-pollinate, and we're scaling those models for the COP30 policy tables. And this matters because climate collapse isn't a future threat anymore. We're burning through the Amazon today. And our Rio school isn't just about including Indigenous voices. It's about handing them the mic, the agenda, and the power. Colonial democracy got us here. Indigenous-led governance, that's the exit door.
That sounds amazing and interesting. I'm very excited for the Rio School.
Thank you so much for the answers you shared so far, Denali. They've been so incredible to listen to and so interesting. So the next question we have for you is, you have worked to bring Indigenous research practices into institutional and digital spaces. And what challenges have arisen in translating lived experiences into digital tools, and how have you gone about addressing those concerns and misrepresentation of data ownership?
Oh, okay. So this question I'm less prepared for because one, I didn't pre-write it, but also it's an ongoing struggle. In the early days, I was bright-eyed and ready to die on every hill. But at some point you realize that the bureaucracy, it's not malicious. It's just huge. And it's not designed for variance. Like, it's a big ship and slow to turn. And basically we're asking it to turn in directions it was never meant to turn in. And so it can feel really personal. It can feel like these are personal attacks when people don't understand what it is you're doing and they don't know how to make space for it. But it's not. It's that the structure was built to do a specific thing, and it's doing it, it's working. But we've now infiltrated those structures. It's not just white men dominating those spaces. We now have a diversity of people, diversity of worldviews and approaches and protocols and practices. And we're trying to find ways to fit those in, ways to expand the system, ways to use tools that were never meant to do these things. And it is a constant exercise in frustration and epiphanies and despair and hope. It's so much. Yeah. Initially with my mapping project, I was trying to use ArcGIS to map the stories into a system. And I cannot tell you the hours of frustration and tears and just trying, one, to understand a system that is just crazy difficult, but the other, to understand how to translate what seemed so obvious and organic hero stories into something that just wasn't fitting it. And I had to give up. I had to walk away from that. And from the months and months of training and work and practice and exercise, I had to say, this is not the right fit. And it's hard when you invest a lot of time into something. It's hard to recognize that this is not the right fit. But I did. And I've switched. I'm now using carto.com, which is a cartography software that is much more intuitive. And I mean, I don't want to be like an advertising for them, but it allows for a more dynamic understanding of what a map could be. It's less about just a physical point and more about what are the stories you're trying to tell using geospatial. And so that's been something that was a much better fit. And it's not perfect by any means. And it's also a learning process of what is it that I put in? Again, so much of the stories, the context of it can't be translated into the map. So it's a very interesting and mind-boggling and mind-expanding process of trying to conceptualize something in a different way. And I don't know, I think for myself, I've conceptualized it this way the whole time, and I think that my community does too. But when you're looking at a software that doesn't, it requires a lot of mental, I don't know what you call that. Like it's just a lot of work. And there's a lot of failing, but you just keep trying. Yeah. Not a great answer.
No, that was a perfect answer. And I think a lot of us relate to the struggle of, translating something into data software. And I think that's a really good point that you've made. So I completely agree. And thank you, for touching on that.
So, in what ways can digital mapping and narrative cartographies empower communities to assert political agencies, reshape governance processes, or reimagine Indigenous nationhood from the ground up?
I don't know that we need to reimagine Indigenous nationhood from the ground up. But what we do need to continually reimagine is our relationship to settler colonial nations and them to us. I don't think there's anything wrong with Indigenous nationhood. Digital mapping doesn't reimagine Indigenous nationhood. My work doesn't. I don't know that any Indigenous work reimagines nationhood in the way that it would be read here. Rather, it's about making visible Indigenous nationhood in ways that are often invisible in the dominant narratives. So digital tools have democratized mapping and allowed us to challenge the colonial grip on who can make maps, what is legitimate knowledge, how is knowledge used and shared. We have this idea that the world looks the way the Cartesian map is. Someone made that. We know now that that was not accurate, that someone did the best they could, but Africa appears at a much different scale than what it actually is. And the way that, like, we know that politics are embedded in the way that we map and in the way that the ideas of borders have been put forward over the last millennia. So as we become more aware of those things, we become more capable of disrupting them and saying, this is one view. It's not the only view. So how do we make visible other views? And so from the ground up is just saying, here are multiple views. And we're not saying, at least I'm not saying, that the maps in existence are wrong. It's not about right or wrong. It's about recognizing whose view they reflect and whose politics they serve. Within the politics that they were created, they're not wrong. That's not my politic. So it doesn't fit for me. And it doesn't fit for anyone else who doesn't follow that politic. So how do we represent ourselves? How do we represent the maps that make sense to us? So I don't want it to be an adversarial approach. I just want it to be about disrupting the default, because the default is not neutral. It's value laden. So digital mapping is one tool, but the agency really comes from who controls the narrative. And for example, colonial archives tend to frame Indigenous nations as relics. And digital story mapping says we're still here, still governing. Indigenous communities have always engaged in geospatial tools. The reason we're talking about it now is because the digital tools have democratized that geospatial representation in a way that disrupts that colonial power and that hold over the narrative. So colonial archives, they're full of land records, treaties, maps, data that erases Indigenous identity, history, territories, Indigenous sovereignty, essentially. But until recently, they had control over the visibility of that historical displacement. They had control over those other, quote, other spatial representations. So thanks to digital innovations, those archives are now being questioned and called to account for their narratives. We are now asking them to be transparent about the power that they serve. But it's important to remember that they do what they were designed to do. So in calling them to account, there's only so far that that goes. They are mechanisms of statecraft, and the narratives that they build serve state legitimacy. So I think of it like this, like the police were not created to protect people. They were created to protect property and power. And so asking them to serve communities, which in the last decade has been a huge push and a lot of protests about the police need to do this, we're demanding a new institution entirely. The archives are the same. They're a statecraft tool, not a neutral record keeper. So when we demand that they decolonize, we're essentially asking them to stop being what they are. And if so, is our goal to replace the archive or repurpose it? And are we asking for something that can be done? And on the other hand, we can use those colonial maps to fight for land, to fight for our rights, to assert those things. And that's strategic subversion. But parallel systems are non-negotiable. We have to have them. We can't just fight and ask for the state to be something that it isn't. We have to create something else. So for example, like there's a Zapatista movement in Chiapas where they prioritize community memory over state validation, right? So there are digital tools that aren't just about access, they're about control. Who has those memories and how do they put them out there and in what ways and what does it serve? So why beg for colonial archives to recognize us when you can build databases that don't require their validation? I think both are important, but I think it's also super important that we always be cognizant of what we're asking. And if in asking that, are we still centering power in the one we're asking? When instead we could just say, no, thank you. We're going to do something else.
You've sort of touched on this question, but could you just building on the process of digital mapping and narrative cartographies, would you say that these are important steps in decolonizing national and provincial archives?
I think that there's a great aspiration to decolonize these things, and I see steps being taken. Like you look at MOA in Vancouver, the Museum of Anthropology. They're a beautiful example of a, quote, museum that is doing everything it can to keep ownership in the hands of those who own these pieces, to keep it with Indigenous people. Even their digital archives have controls set up so that not everything is available to everybody. If you are from that community, you can log in, you have credentials, I don't know the details, but you can log in and have access to the things that you've been permitted access to. Not everyone has the same access levels. Certain, obviously, elders would have different accesses. Certain families have access to different types of materials. And they've found ways to put controls in place that disrupt this idea that museums, in this case, own whatever they want to own and can show it to whoever they want to show it to. So in this example, you have an archive where the community is an active part in deciding what and how material is shared, and they still have access to that material, but they also are saying, yes, we want the public to come and see things, not everything, but we do want to share our material culture. Please come and be a part of that. It's beautiful, we're proud of it. It's available to be shared, but not everything. And so there are these wonderful examples where you see archives being democratized, being indigenized, essentially. But then you also have things like the Library of Canada that still lists Indigenous people, like the National Archives still lists Indigenous people as like savages and Indians. And, can they change that? No, because in order to archive the data they have, that is the language that is in the documents. You cannot retroactively go back and replace those words without also replacing the history, which is super important. Just like we would never want Germany to go back and replace the Holocaust with better language. We would never want that. And so there is a need for some of those archives to maintain those grotesque, inappropriate systems. But could they be better? Absolutely. Again, how much better? I don't know. Maybe instead, national and provincial archives, maybe we just need to start reinventing something else.
I appreciate you saying that because history is very important and also like an important step in knowing what to do better. So thank you so much for your response.
All right. I think we could have so many more questions we could ask you, Denali, but thank you so much for everything you've answered for us so far. We have one more question for you today. Like I said, I have so many we could ask you. But looking ahead, what do you envision as the future of this work, both in your own research and in broader conversations around Indigenous identity, cultural resilience, and democratic innovation?
Great question. There is so much to unpack with this. So first, I want to address the term resilient. When we apply the term resilient to Indigenous people, it often functions as a colonial backhanded compliment. In centering settler state violence as a defining condition of Indigenous life, it frames Indigenous strength as reactive to oppression. And this framing is state-centric. It's positioning Indigenous existence within a dichotomy of surviving colonialism, rather than recognizing Indigenous sovereignty, creativity, self-determination as its own thing. So describing Indigenous people as resilient prioritizes colonial harm as the starting point of these stories, erasing a millennia of governance and innovation of relational systems. So I reject the word resilience in this context. And second, in the conversation on Indigenous identity, the work is about continuous sovereignty practices that exist outside of colonial time and logic. These hero stories are not about bouncing back from trauma. That is certainly in there. But hero stories are not a trauma response. They're about kinship in action, a democratic practice of care and decision-making that maps authority through reciprocity, not resistance. Asking what the future of this work is in the context of democratic innovation presupposes a colonial hierarchy of knowledge. By positioning Indigenous systems as contributors to an Anglocentric project of innovation, replicates the epistemic violence that we're trying to disrupt. So let us instead ask, what does it mean to frame millennia-old Indigenous governance traditions as innovations within a settler colonial political imagination? The language of innovation inherently centers the Anglosphere, and that modernity linear temporality, where democracy is framed as Anglocentric, Euro-American, an invention of theirs requiring periodic upgrades. So this erases two critical realities. For example, one of those, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Great Law of Peace, which predates modern constitutional democracies by 6 centuries. Yet its influence is a footnote in democratic theory. And Indigenous governance systems like the Maori and the centering of relational accountability, which embodies continuous innovation through protocols for intergenerational stewardship, ecological reciprocity, these kinds of Indigenous knowledges, these Indigenous governance structures, they're not available to be periodic reforms to the Anglo-centric system. These are much older systems that have been working and continue to work. So it's important not to position Indigenous governance as a novel input for the Anglo-centric democracies. It's the settler state that innovates upon and weaponizes Indigenous systems, extracting concepts like federalism while simultaneously destroying the original context of kinship responsibility that is tied to that. Indigenous governance does not merely offer technical fixes like participatory mechanisms. They challenge foundational assumptions. So to truly innovate democracy, we need to reject the contributions framework that reduces Indigenous knowledge to an extractable resource. And we need to center land as governance and recognize that the Anglo-centric democracies, these crises, the climate collapse, inequality, these all stem from its divorce from Indigenous governance principles. And third, where do I fit in all this? Where does my project fit? I don't know. Most immediately, the stories need to be returned to my community in the form of a book, because that's what my community wishes. After that, I don't know. I've learned a lot, and the hero stories that were shared with me, they're so rich in teachings. I can only hope that I continue getting to learn from them. I hope that I can carry these forward in a postdoc and in my life work. This will always be my life work because this is my life. This is my community. These are stories about my aunties, my uncles, my kokom, my nieces. These are our stories. So this will always be my life. And in whatever form that takes, I will be continuing to do this work. But I don't know what that form is.
That was such an important response. There were so many important points made. So thank you. And I want to thank you specifically for that rejection of the word resilience, because I think a lot of times it can be very easy to forget how important, how crucial, and how definitive language can be. So that was also a very important reminder. So thank you for that. And again, a wonderful response. I will turn it over to Nadim to wrap us up here.
I'm just gonna say one thing. Thank you so much, Denali. This has been so insightful, informative, and I really appreciate the opportunity it gave us and our audience that are going to listen to this, to unlearn those harmful beliefs. I really appreciate that. So thank you so much for your time.
I just want to say thank you so much for your time today, for giving us such amazing responses to our questions, and I hope we will be able to communicate soon enough about, and I hope your work with Participedia continues to go great. And so thank you for joining us today with just participation.
Thank you. It's been lovely to share these things. I love talking about the work, and I love that you guys are also involved in really great work.
Lama, welcome to Just Participation. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to have you. So the first question we're just going to ask you today is, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Absolutely, and thank you for inviting me. So I'm a community planner who uses storytelling as a tool for public engagement and social change. In 2005, I founded Building Bridges with Rwanda, a nonprofit organization that brought me back to my birth country to support post-genocide reconciliation and rebuilding efforts. I spent 5 years working alongside Rwandans committed to rebuilding a just society after the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis. Upon returning to Canada in 2015, I became involved in housing justice and the fight against gentrification in Vancouver's downtown east side. I worked alongside unhoused residents and advocates to resist the displacement caused by developers who were buying up single-room occupancy hotels and converting them into luxury units for high-income earners. This practice has only deepened Vancouver's housing crisis and dramatically increased homelessness. In the downtown east side, we built solidarity among residents and allies to hold municipal leaders accountable and assert that housing is a human right. Our message was clear. Everyone deserves a home where they can live with dignity, surrounded by friends and neighbors, with access to safe and affordable housing. In 2016, I learned about the displacement of Hogan, a vibrant Black neighborhood demolished in 1970s under the guise of urban renewal. When the Georgia and Dunsmuir viaducts were built, Black homeowners were uprooted without consultation. The decision prioritized commuter convenience over community integrity, erasing Vancouver's only Black neighborhood. Many former residents, disillusioned by this injustice, left Vancouver altogether. Today, when people ask where Black folks live in Vancouver, the answer often is, there isn't a Black community here. That erasure wasn't accidental. It was by design.
Wow, that's such an interesting story. Like I'm so grateful we're getting to talk about this with you. Just a little follow-up question. Can you discuss some of the challenges and victories you faced while serving on the board of the Hogan Society?
When we formed the Hogan Society board, it grew out of Hogan Working Group, a coalition of community leaders, activists, academics, and professionals. One of our key challenges was uniting people from our diverse backgrounds around a shared vision. Coming from grassroots organizing, working directly with people facing housing injustice, addiction, and mental health challenges, I often notice a disconnect in understanding class dynamics among some board members. However, my experience proved crucial in rallying community support for the revitalization of Hogan. When the city of Vancouver held public hearings, residents from downtown east side, Chinatown, and other marginalized communities showed up in solidarity. Their presence helped secure unanimous approval of the Hogan motion, powerful victory grounded in a collective action.
Awesome. Oh, that's amazing to hear. I will pass it on to Nadim for the next question.
How do spatial justice and cultural memory inform democratic participation in urban or regional planning and housing?
When the city of Vancouver announced plans to remove the Georgia and Dunsmuir viaducts, Black residents responded by invoking the erased memory of Hogan and demanded redress. To his credit, then Mayor Gregor Robertson acknowledged the injustice and express the city's commitment to making amends. In consultation with the Black community across Metro Vancouver, a strong consensus emerged. We needed a cultural center that is active 24/7, a space for celebration, education, and organizing. We also envisage affordable housing and Black-owned businesses anchored by a community land trust model to protect against displacement and promote self-determination. Spatial injustice and cultural memory are essential. Without them, planning decisions continue to reproduce inequity or inequality, I should say.
Thank you so much, Lama. I loved how you're talking about like everyone deserves a home to live with dignity and access to affordable housing. And I also love the tie into like anti-Black oppression in your work. How would you envision community-led activism evolving in the fight for housing justice in Vancouver?
Well, Hogan Society now serves communities across the Lower Mainland. As a member of its community engagement and research committees, I use walking tours to tell the hidden story of Hoganzali and to engage Black youth in advocacy. We are organizing across municipalities in Metro Vancouver to address housing injustice that disproportionately affect Black communities. In New Westminster, where we've seen the opening of the first building to house both African Indigenous renters. My organization, Building Bridges with Rwanda, is also leading a youth leadership program where African newcomer youth advocate for dignified, affordable, and safe housing. It's unacceptable that a wealthy country like Canada and a progressive city like Vancouver cannot meet basic housing needs. The issue isn't lack of resources, it's lack of political will. Decision makers need to be held accountable to prioritize housing as a human right.
That is so insightful, and I really appreciate you sharing light into that. Would you like this is not off the questions, but I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about the walk-in tours because I feel like I researched a bit about Hogan's Alley, and it does have some history of systemically excluding Black communities and many of their descendants so far. I'm just curious if you're able to talk a bit more about the walk-in tours that you did in Hogan's Alley. I'm sorry, like if you don't want to answer it, that's fine.
No, that's fine. It's actually my passion because I find that when I facilitate walking tours, it's a conversation along the way. I give them facts. We often talk about people, place, and policies, and they ask questions. Those questions are very insightful because they help me understand what's out there, what people know, and what people are interested in. So I always come up. I come with a way with really deepened understanding of what people need to learn. And also, as I explain this tragic history and talk about Black resistance and the successes we've achieved over time, I'm very inspired. And it really shows interest in urban planning, that it's not just something that should be relegated to policymakers, but community residents really need to engage and understand each other's pain.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for talking more about it because I was just curious. So
Yes.
Thank you again so much for answering that additional question, Lama. It was really insightful, and I think that analogy that you made about being conversation on the walk was really beautiful. So thank you for speaking more to that. One last question we have for you today, as much as I think we would all love to ask you several more questions. But what advice would you offer to young activists who are organizing around displacement and anti-Black racism in urban spaces?
Well, my advice can be distilled in 3 points. 1, educate yourself on political systems and participate in municipal decision-making. That's where it all starts. It's where change starts, yes. Number 2, build broad-based alliance and act in solidarity with other marginalized groups. As Dr. King said, justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Number 3, learn from movements in other cities and adapt successful strategies to your local context. Young people are the leaders of tomorrow, but they must start leading today. Learn from your mistakes, stay grounded in community, and build the future you want to live in.
Thank you so much. That was so inspiring. And I think those are really, really good 3 points that it really helps. I know at times when you're approaching topics like this, it can be very daunting, especially for the younger generation. So I think this is a really good way to kind of break that down and, understand it in a more digestible way. So thank you for that. I will pass it back to Nadine to wrap us up here. Thank you so much, Lama.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us today and for answering the questions. You were incredibly insightful, and just thank you so much for joining us today on Just Participation.
It's my pleasure, and keep up the good work. Once again, thank you for inviting me, and I hope you continue to inspire your audiences. This is really important work that you're doing. So thank you for including me.
Of course, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being here, Moroti. We're very happy to have you here as our guest. I will start off with asking you to tell us a bit more about yourself and your work, especially focusing on your journey into curator work and how your artistic practice connects with themes of resistance and democracy.
Thank you for inviting me. My name is Moroti George. I am based in Vancouver, BC, so-called Vancouver, BC, on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. As a settler from Nigeria, um, I am the director curator of Gallery Gachet, which is based in the downtown east side of Vancouver. And until the end of this month, I am one of the co-directors and curatorial leads of the Black Art Center in Surrey, BC, on the territories of the Katsi and Semiahmoo people. My journey into curatorial work was a bit interesting. I kind of an amalgamation of things. I went to school at SFU, School for the Contemporary Arts, majoring in Italian literature and political science. And it was just a mess. And I don't really know why I chose that for my life. But I took an elective course, which was Introduction to Art Performance and Cinema Studies, which is basically what SFU calls their curatorial studies program. Then I found out that SFU had a curatorial studies program, and the professor at the time, Denise Alexachuk, invited me to consider it as doing the arts performance and cinema studies program as a minor. I enjoyed it so much because I did always have this very interesting connection to art and history and politics and kind of the intersections between like where we're or I don't want to give myself too much credit for when I was younger, but I was always thinking about why the world is the way it is and how lives are shaped by images and all of that kind of stuff. But I didn't have the vernacular to describe it at that time. So um I joined the program. I worked while in the program and all of that stuff. I did some internships at the Art Gallery, the Capilano University, sorry, Capilano Review, which is a magazine, an arts and criticism and literature magazine in Vancouver. And I also worked a brief stint at the Contemporary Art Gallery in Vancouver. And I always like to tell people about this brief stint because I was fired and it was my fault because I was just doing a bad job. So I did that, and I think in 2021, I was applied to be a curatorial lead and one of the co-directors of the Black Art Center, which was around that time in its founding stages. And I learned a lot from that experience working there for about a year before we doing a lot of public art programming and a lot of guerrilla arts exhibitions. So exhibitions that really aren't exhibitions. Um, and I applied to be the artistic director of Gallery Gachet in 2022, I think. And I got the job, and I worked with the most fantastic person, Demi London, who was the executive director at the time. And I think it was here that I really found my footing, and just knowing what I want to do with my life and defining my curatorial practice a bit more. And I guess all of this to say is that I feel like I'm constantly in the process of becoming. I think that a lot of people, some people, not a lot of people, don't really think about the curatorial as a practice in the way that they think of other artistic practices, in the sense that I think sometimes just because of the tradition of the power dynamic between curator and artist, I think that a lot of the times people think that curators just pop up and know everything and all of that kind of stuff. But it's very much a practice that you need to learn and you need to hone and refine and kind of figure out how you want to address the world and the things that matter to you as a curator. So yeah, I feel like that was a very long-winded answer to your question, but that's it.
No, that's perfect actually. And I really appreciate you giving us a run through like the process of you getting into this work. And I would say give yourself more credit because like reflection, like self-reflection and reflecting on the state of the world is really important.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. That was so interesting to listen to. I think, approaching curatorial work can be very interdisciplinary. So it was really nice to hear how you got into that line of work. And I completely agree that it is an art form. So the second question we have for you today, Gallery Gachet has a long history of centralizing marginalized voices. How do you see art facilitating civic engagement and community healing, particularly in Vancouver's downtown east side?
Yeah, Gallery Gachet is a very interesting gallery, especially within the canon of Vancouver. It started as a collective, and it also it is an artist front center, and I think that it came up a bit behind other artist front centers in Vancouver. I'm thinking a lot about the Western France and the art gallery that were established 10 to 6 years before Gachet. But it was formed out of a collective of artists, made up of a collective of artists who didn't see themselves represented based off their marginality as people living with mental health struggles. And that is essentially how Gachet emerged. And over the years, the gallery's mandate has expanded expanded to really take into account the intersections of marginalization that stems out of mental health struggles to general socio-political marginalization. And I think that that is something that's really allowed for Gachet to work in the way it does, in the sense that we based in the downtown east side and we have the kind of mandates that we do. So I think that there is kind of an inherent responsibility to try and activate the community as best as we can, while also functioning with the reality that regardless of how the gallery emerged and regardless of the work we do, we're still very much could be posed as also in some ways act as agents of gentrification a um, in a community that is already deeply marginalized and over-policed. And I think that I don't want to say what makes Gachet different, but how we function, that is kind of outside of the mold, is based off our engagement with the artists that we work with, artists working with artists who are very much professional and established, but also working with artists based in the downtown east side, as well as emerging marginalized artists. I think that it's very rare to see a gallery that does all three, but also kind of thinking a lot about our community activations, the workshops that we offer, just the space that we offer in the downtown east side as essentially a repository for culture in the downtown east side and the history of the downtown east side. But at the same time, I think that it's also very important that because in the downtown east side stretch, Gachet is one of, I believe, 5 galleries. But what is different is that Gachet is kind of in the heart of the downtown east side. And one of the other galleries is a university gallery. So I think that our responsibilities extend past the other galleries, so to speak. And I think that all of this to say is that Gachet plays the role of highlighting that culture does exist in the downtown east side. Culture is constantly being produced in the downtown east side, even though there is kind of this paradigm understanding of what the downtown east side is and what goes on in the downtown east side. And I try my best to be as pragmatic as possible when I talk about the downtown east side, in the sense that I don't want to work in either extreme and be like the downtown east side is perfect and everybody's crazy for thinking the downtown east side has issues. But the same, and I also don't want to be like the downtown east side is horrible. But I try and be real and say that like every other community and neighborhood, the downtown east side has its issues and they stem from a lot of them are systematic. But some of them are also interpersonal and individual issues. So I think that's by Gachet being here, we kind of act as, I don't want to say the main ground because we are not, but as salient grounds for discourse about the times that we live in, as well as highlighting the people who exist outside society's margins and thoughts and ideas. So yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much for that. I think, as you said, galleries and museums at times can function as a very exclusive space that's very disconnected from the everyday existence. So I think it's really important that you guys are really emphasizing your community engagement and such. So that's awesome to hear.
Hi, so what does radical democracy mean to you, and how is it reflected in the projects you curate or participate in?
Radical democracy to me is a very loaded term. I really think a lot about Jordan. I don't know if we all know her here. And just this amazing lecture she gave um, very early in her career, where she talks a lot about how um, uh, the ways that we enact resistance are always within the system. So, like during the times of enslavement, the goal was that we abolish slavery, and during Jim Crow, the goal was that we abolished Jim Crow, and during like now the police states, the goal is now like how do we abolish or defeat the police state? So we are always kind of addressing symptoms of the problem instead of the problem in itself. And she kind of gives this, she poses this very radical question to me, where she asks if what if the problem is democracy as we know it? And I think that that is a very important thing to ask. Because I think that radical democracy to me essentially means questioning understanding of democracy. If democracy is a system that values the collective as well as the individual, whose collective, which collectives are being most highlighted and which collectives are being most encouraged to participate and have their voices heard, and which individuals and collectives are not. So I think that that is essentially um, like radical democracy to me is actually really questioning the foundation of what democracy is, its limits and mm, its good and also like its drawbacks. I think that it's very important in this time that we are in to kind of understand that the rules of engagements have changed for everybody. Blackness and Black people are not really, um, despite still being a diminished other, um, we're not really subjected or in the ways that we were, and like of course because there are Black people in power who continue to work within the confines of white supremacy. And the same can go for like all marginalized peoples. So I think that now is actually the time to really question that like, is representation enough? Is democracy enough? How do we um, create a system or bring up topics that really address the failings of the systems that we work within as we know them, but not just like criticizing them, but like also perhaps drawing alternative or presenting alternative futures and realities and states of being. So I guess that's what radical, I don't guess, if I know that that's what radical democracy means to me in this instance.
I mean, that's as good as explanations as I've ever gotten. Uh,
That was very powerful. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm gonna ask, how has your experience at the Vancouver Participedia school that you attended influenced your work or thinking on participatory democracy?
I think that the main thing for me, and I know this is such a buzzword that people tend to use a lot, but I think that it really reminded me that community is important and people, it's actually very possible to come from different entry points and different walks of life and still work towards the same goal. I think the Vancouver Participedia um, project had several people, young, old, of different races, and just it was a very interesting room of people. And I think that even though there was so much said by the speakers and the workshops and the engagements, I think that what really stood out to me was just being in these rooms with everybody and like just having these kind of discussions and knowing that we were gathering in one space, so the affect was there. So I think that in all, just to answer your question, I think that it's just revitalized my hope in like society and community and what the collective can achieve once we kind of start working towards a set of goals, not one goal, but a set of goals. So yeah.
That does make a lot of sense and ties into what you said about like questioning the foundations of democracy, like its limits, its drawbacks, and all. So thank you so much. Collective is very important, especially with different groups and, having that solidarity. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. No, that was a really, really enlightening answer. And I really like that you spoke about hope because I think with everything going on right now, hope is something that we all need. And I think it's something we
Yeah.
can kind of lose track of sometimes. So I think it is always good to recenter that with ourselves. So I guess just, on the topic of hope, looking ahead, what role do you think artist-led spaces can play and should play in shaping the future of civic life?
I think that's what artist-led spaces can do and should do, is understanding that we are institutions, yes, but we are not. I wouldn't compare Gallery Gachet to the Vancouver Art Gallery, for example. Like, we are not behest to functioning in the same ways that the larger art institutions have and do. And even though there is a lot of good that come from these institutions, I think that with artist-run centers, we can really dig deep and be raw and um, kind of act as a space for experimentation, but also gathering, but most importantly, discourse. And discourse doesn't always have to be heavy. Sometimes discourse can be fun. I have really been thinking a lot about um, play in arts and just as I'm thinking about play, at first I was really trying to conceptualize it, and I was like, how can I conceptualize play? I was like, actually, no, sometimes play is play. And like sometimes it's kind of good to build an audience that knows what to expect, but like it's also good to extend yourself, be accessible in more ways than just spatial accessibility. So I think that my hope is that artist-run centers begin to embrace their roots a bit more, kind of remove ourselves from rigidity and the idea that we should mimic larger institutions. And yeah, I think that's kind of where I would be, mimic larger institutions and creating a space for general public dialogue. So yeah.
No, that's amazing. I think we all need a little more room for play in our lives. And I think we can, like you said, integrate play into, democracy and activism. So that's such an amazing point. Thank you for that.
No
Um,
problem.
Yes, again, thank you so much for your time today and for your amazing responses. And just thank you so much for your participation today. Really glad you came on.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for our first episode of the season. Stay tuned as we go around the globe and continue to discuss how everyday citizens shape their cities. See you all next time, and thank you for your participation.